Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this very important subject, sibling incest. With me are a couple of experts who will talk about this issue, how to recognize sibling incest, signs and symptoms, and what to do if you need help.
I'm Anna Hahn. I'm the Crisis Program Director at the Sexual Assault Response Center.
Hi, Jody. My name is Matt Cummings. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, and I am the lead therapist at Riverview Counseling and Consulting.
Anna, could you please explain to me what sibling incest is?
Well, incest can best be described as any sexual contact or sexual interaction between family members. That interaction could be physical, such as sexual touching, or non-physical, such as forcing or coercing a child to engage in or watch others engage in sexual acts, showing the child pornographic materials, or even watching the child while he or she uses the bathroom, dresses, or takes a shower. Sibling incest, then, is when the abuser and the victim are brothers or sisters. The most common type of sibling abuse is between an older brother and a younger sister, but also sister, brother, or older sister, younger brother sibling abuse is also seen. And some exploration between siblings is normal part of development, but if there's a power size, an age difference, or if one tries to keep the other from telling, keeping it a secret, or uses any force, then it would be considered abusive. It can't and should not be kept a secret. Both the victim child and the offending child need to get some help, as well as the parents and the rest of the family. It's very common for me to be talking to a parent and that parent to say that the reason he or she is coming forward is because nothing happened when it happened to them when they were a child.
Anna, this seems like this must be much more common than many of us realize. Could you please explain some signs and symptoms that parents should be aware of?
Sure. Before we actually show the signs and symptoms, I'd like to let parents know that just because these signs or symptoms may be present in a child, that does not mean that they are being abused. These signs or symptoms could be present in any one of us at any time. But what parents should look for is a pattern of behavior change, things that weren't there before, such as sleeping disorders, or sleeping a lot, not sleeping, eating, and other behaviors. So let's go ahead and show those signs and symptoms now. Failure to thrive, weight loss or weight gain, anxiety or depression, feelings of listlessness, phobias or irrational fears, personal space and privacy issues, the child having difficulty with authority figures, being passive, having low self-esteem, the child may be showing nightmares, anger, emotional outbursts, frequent illnesses, maybe withdrawing from things that they normally would like to do, or withdrawing from the family in general. Sympathy issues, not having much sympathy for other people or showing extreme sympathy. Having difficulty sleeping, insomnia or fear of the dark. Also, pain in the genital area, excessive masturbation, or sexualized behavior can indicate an abusive situation may exist. There's an author of several books on abuse, Dr. Weehee, and he's put together a list of some guidelines for parents to consider when they're thinking about some behaviors that are concerning. I like to show those guidelines now. He suggests to identify the behavior, isolate it from the emotions associated with it, and evaluate it. Is the behavior age appropriate? Remember that generally you should confront fighting and jealousy, even if you tend to think it is normal. How often does it happen, and how long does it go on? Acceptable behavior that is long and drawn out may become abusive over time. Is there a victim in the situation? A victim may not want to participate, but may be unable to stop the activity. How does the victim respond? Victims often respond to abuse from a brother or sister by protecting themselves, screaming or crying, separating themselves from the abuser, abusing a younger sibling in turn, telling their parents, internalizing the abusive message, fighting back, or submitting. What is the purpose of the behavior? If it tears down another person, it is abusive.
Thank you very much, Anna. Matt, we now have a much better understanding of signs and symptoms to watch for. Do juvenile offenders have a typical profile that parents should be aware of?
Being able to measure the recidivism in juvenile sex offenders is a fairly new science. It's more difficult to be able to determine whether or not a juvenile would be able to talk themselves into doing something that they know is wrong to a sibling if they have not already been adjudicated or charged and arrested for a criminal sexual offense. We don't have as many of the statistics and numbers as we do on those children who have not been adjudicated, of course, as those that we do. However, we do have some treatment tools that have been proven to show a correlation between some of the variables and some of the symptoms that a young person would experience in their life and a propensity to reoffend. And those would be having a prior sexual offense. That would be having more than one victim. And we found that juveniles who dabble in drugs and alcohol are more apt to commit another offense on a sibling. We found that those who have parents who have criminal histories are more apt to offend a sibling. We've found that those who have used pornography in excess, that have excessive masturbation, those who have a lack of supervision in the home, poor performance at school has been something that we found is a high correlation. Juveniles who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are at a bit of a higher risk to reoffend sexually. There's a lot of factors. However, we should note, as I said before, that this is a very new field and we don't have any assessment tools that have been proven to be 100% effective in preventing sexual abuse or in assessing the possibility of it happening again.
Are there any preconditions that exist that increase the likelihood that sibling incest would occur?
There's 4 preconditions that a juvenile sex offender would go through before that they would be able to go ahead and commit an offense. And this is something that a juvenile sex offender would go through whether their victim would be a sibling or not. First of all, a young person would need to have some motivation to offend. And several times that could be due to what we call blockage as one of the motivating factors, and that would be not having normal, healthy sexual outlets for a person their age. I think that sometimes we get a little hysterical about sex offenses and we don't understand that as human beings we're all very sexual, and it's okay and it's appropriate for children to be sexual on some level. However, those sexual urges and desires need to be kept within age-appropriate boundaries. Another motivating factor is excessive sexualization, and that comes into play a lot of times when a young person is viewing a lot of pornography, or any pornography for that matter. They begin to what we call objectify other people and individuals, where they no longer see a brother or a sister as just that, their brother or their sister, but they might tend to see that person as an object, as a body, as some way to have their sexual needs met. That brings us to the next precondition, the second one, which would be internal barriers. And there's some barriers that a person needs to go through inside themselves, because most often in these cases, the young adults know that what they are doing is wrong. Sometimes children under the ages of 6 have not had education and don't know any different. But now if they were to engage in these in sexualized behaviors, see, that might be right in front of parents, right in front of family at a family function, because they just don't know that that's not the right thing to be doing. Those who do, what they will do is they'll have to go through a process in their mind where they use what we in treatment would call thinking errors. And these are things that they would tell themselves to rationalize and justify and minimize their behaviors so that they can go ahead and talk themselves into doing what they know is wrong. The internal barriers would kind of be our conscience. And so what they would do is they'd use these thinking errors to try to, carve a hole in their conscience so that they can go ahead and get through that barrier. The next precondition to sexual abuse and sibling incest is external barriers. And so once they've been able to have a motivation and they have a desire to be sexual, they need to, as I said, get past their their conscience and talk themselves into doing what they know is wrong, then they need to go ahead and make sure that they're not going to get in trouble, that they're not going to get caught, that they will be able to be successful in carrying through with the sexual abuse. And so that they would need to make sure that there's no parents around, that they won't be seen by anybody or heard by anybody in their offense. And then that brings us to the fourth barrier, which is victim's resistance. This is where terminology that you're probably familiar with in the terms of grooming and maintenance behaviors would take place. A juvenile sex offender would spend quite often quite some time grooming their victim. And when I mean grooming, it's kind of setting the stage. It's kind of setting it so that they know that they'll be able to be successful in committing the abuse without being caught or having any sanctions or consequences for that behavior. Some of the things that we've heard are using like video games and time and spending money and giving their attention to their younger brothers or sisters, saying that if they'll let them do this, that they will spend more time with them and that they won't tell on them for other things that they might have done that were wrong. This is where a lot of times coercion is used. There's 4 parts to coercion, and that's tricks, threats, bribes, and force. And anytime those are in the mix, then there's a sex offense that's taken place.
Anna, if someone thinks sexual abuse, sibling incest particularly, is occurring, what should they do?
The most important thing is to get help. It needs to be reported, and professionals need to do the investigation. You know, parents should not be asking any leading questions or anything for their children. That's why we have professionals who can do that. So a couple of things can happen. Either the parent can go ahead and call CPS if the abuse is coming from within the home, or if the siblings are not in the same home, they could call law enforcement for the jurisdiction where the abuse is occurring or likely to be occurring. What happens then is an investigation will begin. If the parents call CPS, usually what they'll do is they'll do a risk assessment, and they'll try to determine whether the victim child is at risk right now, in imminent danger of harm, or whether the children have been separated and the danger is less. And a CPS worker would be assigned. After the CPS worker is assigned, or a law enforcement officer is assigned, usually the next step would be to call and make an appointment for a child interview. And the child interviewer is trained to ask non-leading questions. So after the interview, then somebody would come in and talk with the parent, either the CPS worker or the detective, and let the parent know in general what was said during the interview. They would let the parent know as well what to expect next. CPS may be able to help by providing a safety plan with the parent, working out a safety plan together to keep the kids safe, or if necessary, if the abusing child may have been removed from the home, then what will happen next. The interviews are set up by CPS or law enforcement only. So also, even to get counseling, there needs to be an investigation begun, because counselors as well are mandated reporters.
Now, in talking about mandated reporters, that of course involves including CPS, which many people are very scared of getting in the system and having CPS have power over their families and children. What are the benefits of CPS being involved, and what would you like families to know about CPS?
CPS can be very helpful in creating a safety plan for their children. CPS, their main objective is the best interest of the child, and that is to keep the children safe. That is their main concern. So if CPS becomes involved, then there are also other avenues that they can use. They can help the family get into counseling. They can help again with the safety plan. They can help through the investigation process and afterwards. So parents, it is a scary thing to call and make a report, especially when it's involving your children. But the most important thing is that the kids get help.
I think there's a lot of myths that exist around CPS. I think that some people might feel that they just want to break families apart and take children out of homes. However, that is exactly the opposite of what CPS wants to do, and for several reasons. Financially, for our budget, and because biological families are the best place for a child to be. So in cases where I've been involved with CPS in my work, I have noticed that they really push towards reunification of families when the families have been taken apart for a period of time. And they do everything that they can to foster and to support families in being reunited so that biological families can continue to exist.
And both of you talked about parents and the difficulty with sibling incest. And in sexual abuse of any kind, oftentimes parents blame themselves and they feel very guilty. And in sibling incest, there can be a lot of reasons to even heighten that self-blame. Matt, do you see this as a parenting issue, or is there something larger going on?
Well, it's very difficult for parents. A lot of times they would blame themselves. Specifically in the case of sibling incest, it's much more difficult because they have both the offender and the victim living in their home, and they love both of their children, and they want help for both of their children. So it can be very difficult, and a lot of times parents take on a lot of the responsibility. However, I really support in treatment parents realizing that they're not the ones that made the decision to sexually offend another person. And there are several safeguards and several protective factors that parents can instill within their families and within their children's lives. And I think I mentioned before the most important one is supervision. Most cases that I see, the abuse happened because of a lack of supervision. If a parent was in the room, then nothing would have happened. It's very difficult to be able to tell when it's okay for kids to be off on their own playing and when there needs to be someone around. And it's kind of ironic, but probably half of the cases of sibling incest that we have treated, the offenses have occurred during family functionings, like a Thanksgiving or a Christmas party or a gathering, where the parents are together and kind of spending time with themselves and doing adult activities, playing cards or whatnot, and the children would be off into a separate room watching videos or unsupervised by themselves. When we have brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles and nephews and things like that coming together.
What type of treatment is available in this type of situation?
Well, what we would normally suggest is that the offending sibling be removed from the home temporarily. We would suggest that the victim be given an opportunity to seek counseling. In cases where the victim does not want counseling and does not want to talk about this, we need to be real careful because we could re-traumatize or further traumatize a child that has been abused by forcing them to talk about it, forcing them to become involved in a treatment process. So we really need to let them take ownership over what happens with their treatment, but it's very important to make that service available to them and to support them in taking that service because it's kind of scary in the beginning. And so, but you do need to be careful not to force them into that situation. As far as the offender is concerned, that would depend if they were adjudicated as a juvenile sex offender in a court of law or not. If they are adjudicated, what we have is we offer often a SOTA program. It stands for Specialized Sex Offender Disposition Alternative. And what that is, it's a 2-year program where after they have been adjudicated, instead of going off to an institution and spending the standard range of 15 to 36 weeks in a state institution over on the West Coast, they would be able to stay here in the community, stay often in their homes or in a foster home in the community or a family home, relative's home, and be able to go to school and be able to seek treatment on an outpatient basis. Usually that would consist of 2 years. It's a 2-year program. And this is for the children who have been, and adolescents who have been adjudicated. What we do is we teach them victim impact. We teach them the perils of excessive sexual thinking, the perils of use of pornography, drugs and alcohol. They have a probation counselor that accompanies their participation in the program. They're offered weekly group attendance, which would involve 5 to 8 other juveniles their age or similar in age and situation. And that, as I said, occurs once a week. And about the first 4 months of the 2-year program, they're asked to attend individual sessions at the rate of once a week. And that transitions down to every other week for the next 6 months or so, and then to once a month the last year or so of the program.
And a couple of terms you used, if you could explain a little bit more, is clarification and family reunification.
Clarification it's a session that is held that involves the family, and there's a real large family component to the treatment that we provide for the juveniles that have been adjudicated, and as well as those that might just be self-referred for treatment, that might have had some touching problems that were not found to be prosecutable by law, but the parents and family would like to get some help to prevent this from happening again. So the clarification session would consist of, once the offending juvenile has been removed from the home, they would go ahead and work with their treatment provider, and the victim would work with their treatment provider, their therapist, and the victim would learn that it was not their fault, that they had nothing to do with it, they're not responsible for this abuse at all. And the offender will be supported in taking 100% responsibility for the offense. They will be supported in writing a letter to apologize. It's our letter of clarification is its title, where they would articulate to the victim again that it was in no way their fault in any way, shape, or form, and that they had nothing to do with them as a person. They need to explain the circumstances around things that were happening in their lives at the time that they were able to talk themselves into doing something that they knew was wrong. And we need to be real careful when we support these offenders in writing this letter to, and particularly when they're explaining about the issues that they were experiencing in their life, to make sure that it doesn't sound like they're blaming or they're making excuses for their offending behaviors. And within this letter, they're given an opportunity to explain to their victim the things that they have done in treatment, the things that they have learned, the things that they have identified as high-risk factors within themselves, things that they need to avoid in order to avoid committing another offense. And those things are shared with the victim and their parents. As I said before, the parents have a real large part of the treatment process. They're involved very much so, because they're the ones that in the next 2 years, when the program is over, they're going to be the ones that are going to be supervising and maintaining safety in their homes. So,
how does that affect the victim?
well, it's really nice. The victim's able to ask any questions that they might have for their offender. They're able to determine that it wasn't their fault at all. They're able to become more comfortable with their brother or sister, because they still love their brother or sister, and even the offender loves them, and they want to be a family, and they have terrible feelings about guilt for having disclosed that the abuse happened and having the offender be removed from the home. So it's very healing, and after this process takes place is when we would support reunification, and only if the family, especially the victim, would feel comfortable with that. What typically would happen is after 2 or 3 months of the family being separated, of the offender being out of the home, the offender and victim will be prepared for this session. They'll come together and we'll go through it. It usually lasts a half hour or so. It's very emotional. It's very strong emotions that are felt throughout that, of course. And then they're invited to go and spend time together and become a family and be reunified.
Thank you for clarifying that. Just in closing, just a couple of things that I'd like to reiterate is just to remind everyone that sexual abuse of any kind is never the fault of the victim. And in sibling incest, it is very difficult for the entire family, but help is available. The last thing you want to do is ignore the problem, because it will not go away on its own.